What if I told you a solar project could face penalties of up to $1 million per day for not being compliant? You may say, compliant for what? I'm glad you asked. As of May 1st of 2026, this year, thousands of inverter-based resources must register under updated NERC Category 2 requirements. And here's the kicker. The compliance threshold, it just dropped from 75 megawatts to 20 megawatts for transmission-connected facilities. That means a lot of operators who never had to think about federal reliability oversight before, well, now they do. And this isn't just paperwork. This is firmware updates, relay protection settings, evidence retention, cybersecurity monitoring, and ongoing audit readiness. And if it's ignored, well, that exposure isn't theoretical. So what exactly changed? Who's affected? And is the renewable industry ready? No worries, we've got you covered. Joining me today is Kellie Macpherson, EVP of Compliance and Security at Radian Generation and a board member at SEIA. Kellie works directly in NERC compliance and grid security for utility-scale renewable assets. She's going to break down what this all means and provide some insight if your project needs to be NERC compliant. Kellie, welcome to the Clean Energy Edge.
Hey, Russ, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
Well, we're glad to have you, and we need some help because this is a big deal, and probably a lot of people aren't really, maybe not hearing about it. So let's start at the top. For people who may not live in this world every day, can you explain what is NERC and what role does it play in protecting grid reliability?
Yeah, so you know how you always have power at your house and you rarely have power outages. A lot of that you can thank NERC for.
Thank you, NERC.
Yeah, NERC started back in the 1970s as a group of utility veterans that were coming together to figure out how to make the grid more reliable as operators. There'd be events on the grid, outages, et cetera, and they'd look at those and try to discover, what happened and how can you make it better. And so, it's interesting. There's been many outages over the years that have been studied and work that has come out of that. But what's most notable, most people hear about NERC is the power outage that happened across the northeastern seaboard in 2003. It was a 3-day outage. Think about New York City. 115 degrees in New York City in the middle of August. Like that is not normal weather, right?
No.
To add to it, there was a meeting of the G8 at the UN in New York City at the time. It's just kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, right? We didn't look so good.
Right.
So out of that outage, Congress passed in addition to the Federal Power Act that made NERC standards mandatory. And so if you think about it, there were fatalities and things like that in the outages. There's real life and death situations for folks. So you think about elderly in those situations, you think about hospitals, et cetera, right? Like it's really a big impact. And so Congress said, hey, glad that you guys are like an organization, but we actually need laws. We actually need requirements that all the utilities are going to follow. So they passed this addition to the Section 205 of the Federal Power Act in 2005. And then the standards became mandatory in June of 2007. So that's when we actually got this body of work. There's over 200 standards that depending on what role you play on the electric grid, you might have to register. You have to follow different laws and register with NERC and follow those laws and requirements. And so that's really where it started is, really health and safety and all of that. And so that's the origin of NERC. NERC is behind reliability on the grid.
Thanks for explaining that. And I think the timeline is really important to think about too, because you mentioned the early 2000s, right? Early 2003, 2005.
Yeah.
And not a ton of clean energy out there at that time. And now we have some changes because we're seeing more and more clean energy. In fact, that's the transition we're in.
Yeah.
So this really NERC didn't affect clean energy projects as much as it has been lately, but even more so now. So can you talk about these changes in sizes and how that's going to impact clean energy projects?
It's really interesting. So in 2007, when they were putting all these laws in place, they also had to come up with this registration criteria. So, are you in or are you out? Do you have to follow them? Do you not? And so at the time, when they did the criteria for generator owners and generator operators, they actually never imagined that solar, let's just use solar, for example, could ever get as big as it is. So in 2007, if you were a coal plant and you were connected at 100 kV, and you were 20 megawatts and above, you had to register with NERC and follow all the laws. But if you were a solar or a wind site in 2007, connected at 100 kV, you only had to register if you're 75 megawatts and above, because nobody ever thought the sites could get so big or could actually impact the grid in the way that they do. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting. So we kind of got this like pass for a little while, if you will, as an industry where we didn't have, not all of the sites, just, the really large ones as they got, as they get bigger and bigger, had to comply. And some people argue, a solar site is, 6-10 acres large, right? And they're in these different sections. And so they don't have that same, singular point of failure that maybe take like a hydro plant, for example. It's really interesting. Yuba City Water Agency right now in California, the penstock broke at their largest dam operation, and they're going to be out for 2 years, and they're not, and that area is now down by 200 megawatts. Guess what?
Wow.
Like there's a battery storage project that they're able to push, quickly the construction on, pull that battery storage project online, and it's gonna, help with that deficit that they have because you can put renewables in so quickly. But if you think about it, there's been this kind of like just not maybe like disbelief or just not thinking that renewables could really actually be a solution for so long. And so, we've seen some other grid events since 2007. Lots of people like to talk about the Blue Cut fire in 2018, where, a bunch of renewable plants didn't act correctly during a grid event and actually exacerbated the grid outage. And so that because of those things and studying those events, now folks are like, NERC's like, oh, okay, like you guys are impactful. You can be a solution. And because of that, now we need to change the registration criteria down to 20 megawatts. So it's just the same as the coal plant down the street, right? So now if you're connected at 20 megawatts, and then they did something really interesting, it's at 60 kV or higher. So there's actually more scrutiny on renewables because traditional generation has still stayed connected at 100 kV. So, but yeah, that's the change that we're going through right now. And we're trying to get all these renewables ready for that May of 2026 this year, get them ready to be compliant with those NERC standards. And it's really cool. And I know that sounds lame as the compliance person, but it really validates what renewables are bringing to the grid, right? That it really is a solution, that we've grown incredibly as an industry. And it's really neat, that we have this opportunity to show the industry that we can be, just as compliant as that coal plant.
Right. And, we should be. And I understand it makes sense. The evolution of 20 years ago, there was some solar and there was some wind, but it's
not battery storage.
Right. Yeah. You didn't really see battery storage.
No.
So the evolution of the technology and the affordability, the economics, obviously that paints that picture. So yeah, we're playing in the big leagues, right? So to speak, as far as the clean energy, with other power generation sources. So with that comes more responsibility in this NERC compliance. So let me ask you this: when people hear register with NERC, it's more, that can be scary, and it is more than just paperwork. So can you tell us, what does compliance actually involve in practice?
Yeah. There's one example that I love to explain to people. So registration is, similar to your car registration. You're submitting some paperwork, but it's closer to like the IRS audit situation where you're going to be audited. You're going to do self-certifications every year, et cetera. It's an ongoing monitoring process. It's not just like a fill out the paper and walk away, right? But what's really interesting and what we're seeing with a lot of these assets that we're trying to get ready now is that the technology is struggling to keep up or to meet the new standards and those requirements that they've not had to meet before. So if you think about it, the best example I like to use is inverters. So, all of these sites have some sort of inverter technology. A site that was built in 2010, it could have Eaton inverters. Eaton isn't available to make changes to those inverters anymore. Some of that equipment is outdated and it's not capable of meeting those settings. And one of the NERC standards, there's a trio of PRC, of protection system standards that say, this is how you have to operate to be a good neighbor. If there's an event on the grid, this is how your facility is going to respond, right? This is how you're going to trip. This is how you're going to operate, et cetera. And so those inverter settings have to get changed to be a good neighbor on the grid. Well, we're running into the instances where you can't, the equipment isn't capable of meeting those changes, or, and sometimes they are capable. So, I think we're seeing probably 5 out of 6 times they're capable, maybe 7 out of 10 times they're capable of meeting those requirements, making those changes. And then when they are, then we have to document it and have screenshots of those settings. And then we file that evidence and, maintain this evidence package. So then when you go to audit every 3 to 5 years, you're ready for that audit. So,
right.
Yeah.
So let me ask this question. Whenever these upgrades are being made, these inverter adjustments or what have you, how often are we seeing? Is there a certain year, like predating 2015, where it's really a problem, or is there a certain year that people want to be, kind of focused on? Of, hey, we may have to have some somewhat significant upgrades.
I think everything that's kind of like post 2018. After that Blue Cut fire, I think we, and that's what's really cool about our industry. We don't get enough credit for this. We get so much negativity by the utilities about renewables, right? And people just complain and things like that. But what's really cool about renewables and our industry is that we're actually really nimble and we're really good at lessons learned. So you had that Blue Cut fire in 2018. We came under all this scrutiny about our protection settings and how we interact with the grid. Well, guess what? Everybody heard it. We listened. We heard what was happening, and people started making changes to the equipment, improving that. A lot of the big OEMs took that feedback and started implementing it into their new construction sites right away. So I think there's kind of this 2018 to 2020, there was a shift in our industry where we started to, people finally understood, it wasn't just a bunch of finance guys building solar, from their office in New York, but you ended up with much more utility operator background, building these sites, understanding how they impact the grid. And so we've seen a lot, from 2018 on, we've seen a lot of improvement. But I think if you're anything pre-2018, I definitely get nervous about those sites.
Yeah. Well, and the inverters themselves, if it's typically they're in the 12 to 15 year lifespan for these inverters. So it's probably getting close enough to time to upgrade anyways and just do it all in one shot. So maybe the schedule works out in their favor a little bit.
Yeah. And, I think it's interesting. We've seen on a few of the wind sites that the OEMs are charging, a lot of money to make some of these changes. And so, some of it, I do worry about the economics of a project as well. And that, we're not in a situation where a project's being put in economic distress because an OEM kind of has a monopoly on the market as well. So I think, if you're one of those earlier sites, getting in front of this sooner than later is going to be really important because, we've seen OEMs come back with, $500,000, $600,000 bills to make changes to the inverters. And on these small 20-year PPA, long-term PPA contracts, there's not a lot of room, to make a capital investment like that. The OpEx just can't afford it. So definitely time is really, we're running out of a lot of runway here to figure these kinds of things out for folks. Yeah.
Yeah, because the timeline on this, let's touch on that a little bit.
Yeah.
And this kind of leads into that next question of what are operators really underestimating right now? And maybe I'm answering it for you. Is it the timeline? Because we're looking at May of this year, which isn't that far away.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me really nervous. I posted something on my LinkedIn, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. I was just feeling a little frustrated, and I was like, "Why aren't you guys registering?" Like if you're an asset owner out there, like, gosh, I'm like, how do you not know this is happening? You right? And that I'm like, this is like every day I work on industry outreach to make sure this is known, and I'm not the only one that's pushing. So I'm like, okay, first, how do you not know? And then second, how are you not taking this seriously and working on it? And I hate to use the fear tactics, right? Like I really dislike that so much. But a second follow-up post that I made on LinkedIn was to say, hey, the NERC fines for not being compliant can technically, letter of the law, so like I'm not like fabricating this, but they could be $1 million per day per violation, right? And so it's like, why aren't you getting in front of this? And I think we just still have this reticence to take it seriously, to understand like how much work it actually is, right? I think people are underestimating, you need policies and procedures, you need a compliance manager, you need to pull all those inverters. A 50 megawatt site, 48 inverters that you need to pull screenshots for, go through a validation process and ensure that all those inverters are correct. And that's not even making changes, but if you need to make changes, now you need, an engineer to come in and review the changes, program changes. And now you may, if your technology, depending on your technology, you may need a tech out to site to touch all 48 of those inverters. Like that's like not a fast process to get through.
No, these things take time.
Yeah.
I think creating a sense of urgency is important because I'm going to put myself in the chair of an operator. If I'm not aware of this, or I kind of thought about it, but I put it on the back burner, and I'm we're about there. I'm glad someone reminded me. Thank you, Kellie, for bringing this back up. That you're doing them a favor, even though if it may feel like maybe you're not. So what happens if a site doesn't comply?
Well, and that's where we get, I do want to say, like, we've got this May 1st, 2026, like you need your registration paperwork submitted. You need to be compliant with the standards that are applicable. It's a smaller subset of all of the standards to start with. And it's going to slowly roll out where more and more standards are going to be applicable. And there is this opportunity to say, hey, like there's a couple of standards where you could have a little bit more time like based on the implementation timeline, but you really, are needing to be ready to go May 1st of 2026, letter of the law, they can start auditing you, right? And we don't know what the audit schedule is going to look like. We do know, like if we look at history from June of 2007, they picked 12 generators as guinea pigs, as examples, and they audited them 6 months into the registration and used it as an example to industry. And they were very kind about it, right? Like they didn't fine them $1 million per day. They fined them a little bit. But we don't know what the regulators are going to do. And I think the other side of it that I think we talked about this a little bit previously, but I think there's a lot of political pressure around renewables right now. And I think what is really cool, again, I know this is like so nerdy as a compliance person, but what is really cool about this is it's like the ultimate trump card, right? Because you're like, hey, I can be just as compliant as a coal plant down the street from us, and I can be a good neighbor to the grid. So why aren't we? If we care about renewables, and tell me those operators don't also have a development arm at their, most have some sort of development arm, or they're a third-party operator who operates a developer's assets once they hit operations, right? Like it's a circular economy here. We all should want to make sure that everybody's on top of this and being fully compliant, because it actually takes the pressure off all of those negative arguments about how renewables aren't good neighbors, are destroying our grid and have, horrible reliability impact to the grid, right? This is actually really cool because it takes what's the biggest argument we've heard for the last 3 years from utilities? Renewables suck. They ruin the grid, right? Like, well, guess what? Like, if all these sites have to be compliant with NERC, that argument goes away. And then what argument are we making about renewables? Then we're talking about affordability. And we're like, hey, guess what? Like, this is actually the most affordable thing. And then the second argument then becomes, well, we need electrons on the grid. Like, we're in an electron crisis in the United States. Well, guess what? What's the fastest way to get electrons to the grid? Renewables.
Energy. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, come on, people, like, you got to get compliant. You got to do a good job. Like, this is literally like the biggest green light we've ever gotten as an industry to show up and like take away all of the naysayers about renewables.
Yeah. No, I love how you put that, because it is, I mean, clean energy, renewables, we have to dot our I's and cross our T's and pretty much play the game perfect, because there's that we're
the scrutiny is just so bad.
The scrutiny is. And as far as the auditing, I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say I could see a lot of scrutiny coming up on renewable projects just because of the politics of where we're at right now. All the more reason for operators to definitely take this serious, but recognize it's also manageable if you move forward and do things the right way. So, that brings me to this, and we had talked before, and you were telling me a little bit more about this. So one part that we don't see, I think, getting enough attention is cybersecurity. And you mentioned whenever we talked before about the intrusion attempts of cybersecurity of these projects. So can you talk a little bit more about what that landscape looks like? Because that's part of the NERC compliance as well, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, they passed the first set of standards in June 2007, and NERC was like, oh, we forgot something really important. We forgot about cybersecurity. And so they passed cybersecurity standards in July of 2008. And so we've actually had this kind of best practices around cybersecurity since 2008 as an industry, but they've just continued to evolve because the attack on the grid, right? Like our attack surface has continued to get bigger and wider. And especially with these renewable assets being operated remotely, it adds additional risk. But you know, we've seen that increase. It's going to be really interesting. We're going to see a lot of federal policy over the next 6 months really focus on cybersecurity. And I think we're very close to some executive orders that are going to change the way we operate on a day-to-day basis. And that's because we're seeing, like, for example, the intrusion attempts is one of the largest examples. You know, we have sites that are, you know, out in the middle of the desert, right? You're like, they're in the middle of nowhere. Their biggest physical security threat that site has is like someone coming and stealing copper wire or kids out shooting panels, you know, target practice, right? So you're like, what, you know, like there's no security threat here. But what you don't see is the cyber side of it, where we're constantly seeing intrusion attempts by foreign adversaries, right? And that threat is real. We see sites with over 500 intrusion attempts a month, right? We run our diagnostics and we're looking at that. You know, they're under threat every single day. And there's lots of examples to point to of things that have happened, but you know, there was the Suspects virus. They did that. They actually blew up a turbine generator in a lab setting a couple years ago. But you know, it really showed you, like, you really can, you know, cause destruction to the grid. You know, we've seen that in Poland, we've seen that internationally in other places, and it's all goes back to reliability. Think about June 2000, you think about August of 2003, right? Like that was an outage, affected life, right? Like it really affected our lives. If you think about that, what is going to really disarm Americans? Like, you know, the electric grid is a huge vulnerability.
Well, especially right now, this moment in time with the growth of consumption, the data center, AI, the electrification of things, and the fewer generation sources. You know, you've got these legacy plants, fossil fuel plants, scheduled to close down, right? They're supposed to be shut down. They've got a certain life. In some instances being ordered to stay open by the government. Which is, I mean,
San Onofre nuclear power plant off the coast of Southern California, you know, it was supposed to be, you know, mothballed. I guess I think we might be at 20 years now at this point, but you know, it's been 10 plus years that they're supposed to be, but we didn't have the generation to, you know, to meet that demand. And so it continues to be operable.
Yeah. And we're just in a bad spot right now
Mm-hmm.
with electrons. There's a shortage. It's
Mm-hmm.
every day is getting worse.
Yep.
Another data center going up, another cat video being kept in some data center or whatever. So it all costs electrons, right? And
Yes,
we
it
just
does.
don't have enough that we're
Yeah.
bringing on. Not to mention, but I'll mention it anyway, the attack on clean energy and not
Yeah.
bringing that to the grid or even on the behind the meter side. So
Yeah.
any cyber attack that could bring down a power generation source, that's just going to be an even, that could turn into something pretty catastrophic, it seems like.
It could. And there's two layers to it too. There's like the emergent, like it, we lose power, right? And the domino effect. The second thing is how quickly can an executive order about cybersecurity be passed, and how quickly could we be under scrutiny that says, I've been diving deep into the FIOC, the Foreign Entity of Concern discussion on cybersecurity right now. And so there's going to be a lot of spotlight on, the Chinese parts, right? Different pieces of equipment and things like that. And so how quickly are you from an executive order that could really stall out our industry, right? Like if all of a sudden we have like a really restricted list of equipment that we can use, like it's tough, and so I think it's like, it's not hard to follow NERC compliance. It's not hard to have good cybersecurity practices, right? Like it's not difficult. It's just a matter of caring enough and getting, maybe you need an expert to help you, but it's not hard, right? Like it is totally feasible for all of these sites to do that. And then to be a good neighbor and to help our industry and keep us in a good place going forward. Because we're not going to win the AI race. We're not going to keep up with where we're headed, if we can't keep bringing electrons to the grid. And I just, to build a hydro plant, you're 5 years out from a FERC permit, right? Like, I don't know how we solve the electron crisis without renewable energy, without clean energy coming to the table.
There's no way right now.
Yeah.
I mean, unless there's some miracle technology that's not only developed, but is easily deployable, that's commercially viable.
Yeah.
Clean energy is it. And I agree. People don't really understand that. And that they're going to come to understand it, because as we have brownouts, blackouts, cybersecurity attacks, facilities not being NERC compliant, having to maybe go idle or whatever the situation is.
Yes.
That's going to affect, everybody.
I mean, as soon as you can't fall asleep at night watching your cat videos on TikTok, like your day-to-day life is going to be impacted.
Quality of life is going to really suffer. Yeah, we kid about that, but there's some that are really going to have a problem with those types of things, among others. So,
I might welcome that for my teenagers, though. Maybe I need to have a.
Well, you found that silver lining. Your glass is half full.
There we go.
Well, big picture overall with this, Kellie, what's your overall feeling? Are you feeling good about where things are going in this, with the NERC compliance requirements and the industry in general? Are you kind of, 50-50 or how do you feel just, with your experience and what you're seeing?
We work with some really great owners that have taken this seriously, that started working on this 2 years ago. There's a lot that I'm hopeful about every single day. I think it's we're all totally capable of figuring out the compliance and cybersecurity side. It's not infinitely hard. It's totally like best practices. We're not asking a ton of the industry to do. I'm a little nervous about the folks that have just buried their head in the sand and haven't started working on it. And that makes me nervous, but I'm really excited about where we're headed. And I just, want to continue for those folks that have their head in the sand. That's why, thank you for having me. Cause I think, I keep trying to get the information out there. So those folks that, aren't working on it, hopefully feel compelled to start figuring it out. Cause that makes me nervous, but I know there's so many great folks out there that have taken this really seriously and understand, the long-term effect this has to bolster our industry. So I'm super excited about that.
No, I agree. This is overall a good thing, probably a pinch for some folks, but that's part of it and part of the evolution of what we're doing, which
Yeah.
overall is good. So,
And how cool that we get to have these conversations that, that we've grown so much as an industry that we have that much impact on the grid. Like, let's celebrate the last 20 years of growth. Like, that's really cool.
absolutely. I second that. Kellie, I really appreciate you coming on and breaking all of this down. This is one of those topics that's, I wouldn't say it's flashy or sexy, but so incredibly important. And what this conversation makes clear, it's like you just said, it's not going to slow down renewables. It's strengthening the foundation that they operate on.
Yeah.
So thank you for bringing some clarity into this really complex but critical issue. So where can people catch up with you? What's the best way for people to reach out?
We have our website, theradiangen.com. Follow me on LinkedIn, though. I do a lot of posts where I try to kind of break things down really simply and help folks, understand the requirements, et cetera. So definitely find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with folks.
Awesome. Well, if for anyone watching or listening, we're going to include links so you can connect with Kellie and learn more about her work in compliance and grid security. That'll all be in the description. And as always, if you care about real mechanics behind the energy transitions, not just the headlines, make sure you're subscribed, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks again, Kellie.
Thank you.